Hey guys, how's it going? So after that week break, we're back now with UFC Fight Night Machado Garry versus Prates, and this is a pretty good card, so without wasting too much time, let's just jump straight into our predictions. And opening up the prelims, the first fight of the night is Chelsea Chandler versus Joselyne Edwards. So Chelsea Chandler, most recently she got schooled for 3 whole rounds on the feet with her fight against Viana Santos, where she got knocked down pretty badly in the second, which you don't really see that often in women's fights. And then also before that, she got absolutely demolished by Norma Dumont, but Norma Dumont's pretty good. I could see her fighting for the belt one day, but she got outstruck pretty badly, and then even in the second and third, she sort of got out-wrestled and grappled in that fight. She did have a pretty big upset against Joselyne Muniz, which kind of makes me think that she might pull it off again in this fight, where sort of in that fight with Joselyne Muniz, I thought she was going to lose for sure, but she actually managed to take that one, mainly just through her wrestling. She managed to wrangle the rounds back and got a decision win there, but yeah. Joselyne Edwards, absolute domination against Timmy Vidal in their fight, where she landed pretty much double on the feet and then out-grappled her way to a round 3 submission. However, before that, she was on a 2-fight losing streak, one against Eileen Perez, which isn't the worst loss, but she looked really bad in the wrestling that fight, and Perez sort of made it look easy on the ground. And then her fight against Nora Canol before that was a little closer, but she did end up losing in the striking and sort of made it close with the takedowns and grappling, but ultimately just couldn't get it done. But overall, I think Joselyne Edwards is better on the feet, and I think she'll most likely equalize any sort of wrestling threat that Chelsea Chandler possesses through takedown defense and maybe even her own wrestling. But yeah, I think Joselyne Edwards is going to take this one, and I think it's going to be by a decision win. Next up, we have Timmy Cuamba versus Roberto Romero. So Timmy Cuamba, currently in the UFC, he's 0-2, and these aren't against like amazing opponents either. In his fight against Lucas Almeida, he was getting beat up badly on the feet in the first 2 rounds before sort of coming back in the third with his takedowns, but it really wasn't enough in that fight, and he ended up losing that one by a unanimous decision. Outside of that, his fight with Blackshear was a lot closer. It went to a split decision, but in that fight, he was also just getting beat up on the feet. The only thing that made it really close in that one as well was his wrestling and his takedowns. Moving on to Roberto Romero, only 1 fight in the UFC, so it's kind of hard to judge how good he is, and that was against David Onama, who I think is pretty good and is actually fighting up further on this card. And he did make it close in the first round. He sort of got a bit scrappy in the first, but then he just let the fight run away from him in the second and third rounds and lost that split decision, but it was very close. I do think he is a better striker compared to Cuamba, but I do think Cuamba's wrestling threat might be sort of dangerous in this fight. But I do think that Roberto Romero will take this one, and I think this one's going to be by a decision as well. Moving up the card, we have Jaqueline Amorim versus Polyana Viana. So Jaqueline Amorim coming off 2 back-to-back first-round submission wins, which is pretty good for someone this low-ranked. One of them was over Vanessa Demopoulos, which was really impressive. She took Demopoulos down very easily, not much hesitation, and then locked in this armbar pretty much instantaneously, finishing the fight. There was controversy surrounding whether Amorim was reaching into the glove of Demopoulos to sort of get this armbar in, but the one before that was a very clean submission as well. Before those 2 submissions, she did get a ground and pound TKO against Ruiz, where she sort of took her to the ground and then just laid into her with ground and pound. Early in her career, she lost to Sam Hughes. That's her real only loss in the UFC. But Sam Hughes does have a way of sort of taking things to close decisions and somehow pulling it off, so I wouldn't really put that too badly on her record. But overall, I do think Amorim's a very dangerous fighter, especially when he gets taken to the ground. I think that her submission ability is her biggest weapon. Polyana Viana recently has looked very unimpressive. At the start of her career, she looked like a dominant force, but as of recent, especially her 2 last fights, she's looked very bad. Julian Robertson fight in particular, Robertson actually earned her performance of the night bonus. That's how badly she dominated Viana, and even found a TKO win in the second. And then before that, she got faced up against Yasmin Lucindo, which is kind of a tough opponent, but she got dominated in that fight on the ground, and then in the second eventually got submitted. Lucindo also won a performance of the night bonus of that, so Viana's just giving him away at this point. She did get a knockout over Jinyu Frey in the first round all the way back in 2022, but since then she hasn't really showed anything of much promise or potential, so for that reason I'm going for Jaqueline Amorim, and I'm going to say that she's going to get this one done by a round 2 submission. Next up is Malcolm Wellmaker versus Cameron Saaiman. So Wellmaker, he's coming off a very scary left hook KO on the Contender Series where he sort of slept his opponent decently bad for a Contender Series performance. He looks very powerful, especially when he lets go and throws his power shots, but outside of that, the fight was pretty low volume, and he was getting tagged at different points in that fight by these sort of stiff jabs, and not these hard shots, but he was sort of getting hit with certain shots during the duration of that fight. Cameron Saaiman, he's had a really rough run recently. He's been put up against people like Talbot, who have knocked him out with this sort of sneaky left hook, and then even against Christian Rodriguez he got beat. But once again, it should be noted that this is one of the Christian Rodriguez fights where he misses weight and then fraud checks a prospect. He does that a lot. He'll miss weight and then sort of ruin this prospect that's coming up in the division because he's just so much bigger than him. But despite this, I do think that Cameron Saaiman's really good. He's very technical with his striking. And he does possess a lot of power, as we've seen over with his TKO over Terrence Mitchell. He sort of knocks people down or takes them down, and then on the ground he just sort of wails away at their head and can finish a fight within seconds. Overall, I think I'm going to have to go with Cameron Saaiman for this one, and I'm going to say he's going to get it done by round 2 KO. Next fight on the prelims is Damon Blackshear versus Alatengheili. So Blackshear, he's turning around pretty quickly. His last fight was on that Vettori vs Delete 2 card, where he took on a very aggressive Cody Gibson and won that one. It was actually a pretty impressive win. Gibson came out very hot from the gate and he just started swinging and trying to put away Blackshear very early in that fight. Blackshear sort of waited that round out, was very careful and defensive, and then in the second round Gibson sort of slowed down and Blackshear took that chance to take him down and submit him. And I think that's going to be his biggest threat this fight. I think his submission ability is his biggest weapon, and he showed it through his fight with Cody Stamann. He took him down very easily and sort of submitted him once getting sort of any opening. Alatengheili, pretty standard striker. In the Gutierrez fight, he was getting outstruck pretty badly, and he only really found success in the third round with his takedowns and wrestling. And I think that will be his biggest strength this fight. He only really wins fights through mixing it up with the wrestling, as we saw with the Clayton Rodriguez fight. But in this case, I don't think he'll be able to sort of do well with the wrestling, because I can see Blackshear using any takedown, not even his. If Alatengheili takes him down, I can see Blackshear sort of reversing position and getting a submission this fight very easily. So for that reason, I'm going to have to go with Damon Blackshear, and I'm going to say it's going to get done by around 1 submission. Moving on, we have Chris Gutierrez versus John Castaneda. So Chris Gutierrez, he's had a decently dominant win recently over Quang Lee, where he looks very good on the feet. In fact, significantly better than Lee on the feet, but where he really struggled in that fight was the takedowns, especially in that first round. He just really didn't have an answer for any of the takedowns that Lee was throwing at him, and once he'd get taken down, that was pretty much it. And I also saw the same thing in that Yadong fight that he had. He was doing great on the feet. In fact, I think he was winning on the feet, but it was pretty close. But then he just gave away the second and third rounds by letting Yadong take him down and just sit on top of him for the rest of the round. And I think that's a big hole in his game that could be exploited. Speaking of, John Castaneda, he recently got beat up by Daniel Marcos, which is not the worst loss in history, because Marcos is sort of on a tear at the moment and he is really good. And one thing should be noted, that he did find a bit of success in the wrestling that fight, but once again it just wasn't enough compared to Marcos's constant just beatings. His wrestling is arguably his biggest asset in this fight, and he did actually beat Muniz through his wrestling. He was getting beat on the feet, but then he took it back by sort of getting these takedowns and maintaining top position and all that. And even in his fight against Kyung Ho Kang, he was winning on the feet and also used his wrestling to sort of propel him forwards in the decision. And overall, I see that's how this fight's going to go. I think Gutierrez has a massive hole in his game when it comes to the wrestling and the takedowns and denying the takedowns. And I could 100% see Castaneda sort of wrestling his way to a boring decision, and in that case I do think he'd win. So for that reason, I'm going with John Castaneda by a decision win. Next up is Evan Elder versus Gage Young. So Evan Elder originally set to fight someone else. His original opponent got arrested for some pretty heinous shit, so Gage Young stepped up last minute, thank God. Evan Elder is coming off a pretty good submission win over Darius Flowers, but I don't really rate Darius Flowers as an opponent, so, you know, not the best win, but still a win nonetheless. And he did win against Genaro Valdez in a significantly more dominant style. He was winning both on the feet, and then when he took it to the ground and wrestled at the end of the fight, he looked amazing. And he even had a very close fight with Nazim Sadikov, which I thought was a pretty impressive performance. It got stopped last minute by a doctor's stoppage. You got a cut to get above the eye, which is probably one of the worst places to get cut, so they stopped it. I think a bit early. It was a third round, surely let him ride it out, but fair enough. His opponent, Zhang, he did lose to Quillan Salkeld on the Contender Series in a fight that was predominantly one-way traffic from Salkeld. However, Young was landing at different points in the fight and did some very visible damage to Salkeld. I also think that Salkeld is very, very good, and once again, this isn't me just glazing Perth fighters. You may believe that from my Urseg pick, but you gotta believe me, this isn't glaze. What he did to Anshul Jabli was like amazing, one punch KO, a bit early stoppage, but once again, still pretty good. But I think there's a difference between Salkeld and Elder. I don't think Gage will be able to sort of compete with the UFC level competition in Elder. And Elder's the type of guy, if he's getting beat on the feet, he'll most likely just wrestle his way to a victory and sort of out-grapple his opponent, which I see this fight going in that direction. So for that reason, I'm going to go with Evan Elder, and I'm going to say he's going to get it done by a decision win. And closing out the prelims, we have Matt Schnell versus Jimmy Flick. So Matt Schnell, he's one of the easiest flyweights to be finished. Most of his fights, he either will get finished with a KO or a submission. Cody Durden recently made quick work of him in their fight, where he easily found a submission the minute the fight got taken to the ground. And also, who could forget that knockout that Urseg scored on top of him in their fight? If it was a left hook that sort of put him out badly, his head bounced off the floor, sort of propelled Urseg to a title shot, that win. He did have a decent win over Sumadurgi, where he got a submission in the second, I think it was, but you know, these fights where he wins and submits his opponent are few and far between the ones where he's getting put away. Jimmy Flick, really bad striker, and he only really finds success with his wrestling and his ground game and his submission attempts, and that was very well demonstrated in his Malcolm Gordon fight, where he got absolutely dominated on the feet but managed to find a submission. However, if he isn't able to find a submission, he will likely just get taken to a decision and lose. That happened with Nate Manis, where he just didn't do much the whole fight, got outstruck on the wrestling, he didn't do much, got beat. But I could see Matt Schnell being taken down submitted once again, because he is incredibly easy to submit. So for that reason, I'm going to go with Jimmy Flick by round 2 submission. And opening up the main card, we have Ikram Aliskerov versus Andre Muniz. So Aliskerov, everyone knows him recently from his fight against Whitaker. Hamzat pulled out last minute, I know, shock. And he stepped up and got absolutely just beaten. He's known well for that knockout at the end, where Whitaker sort of pushed him up against the cage and hit him with a brutal knockout that put him out cold. But before that, he was a really dominant fighter, and I think given time, he actually would have been a decent contender if he wasn't rushed into that spot. He got a very nasty first round KO over Wally Alves in their fight, where he looked amazing on the feet leading up to the KO, and even in his Phil Hawes fight, it was a little bit closer, but Aliskerov looked way better on the feet and made easy work of him once he knocked him down and finished him. And despite the Whitaker loss, he is actually incredibly dangerous on the feet, and he does possess some brutal power in his hands, being able to sort of turn the tides of a fight and finish his opponents like that. Andre Muniz, his most recent win was against Jung Young Park, which was a very, 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 very close split decision where both fighters looked very unimpressive. Park was winning on the feet, but ultimately Muniz found success in this fight through 11 takedowns spread over 3 rounds. And on the ground, he wouldn't really do much outside of just basic ground and pound and sort of laying on top of him. And he even got reversed at certain points in the fight, making it even closer. I also don't think his striking's that good, because out of all people, Brendan Allen outstruck him when they fought, and then once that fight got taken to the ground, he got pretty much instantly submitted in the third. Ultimately, I think if this fight's a striking match, I think Muniz is just going to get slept. I mean, out of all people, he got beat on the feet by Paul Craig, who is, in my opinion, one of the worst strikers in the middleweight division. But yeah, I think this one most likely will go to Ikram. Even if Muniz managed to get a takedown, I could see Ikram sort of turning the tides and getting some good ground and pound in, potentially finishing him that way. So for that reason, I'm going to go with Ikram Aliskerov by round 1 KO. Next up on the main card is Randy Brown versus Nicolas Dolby. So Randy Brown is coming off a very close split decision, lost to Brian Battle, but there is an argument to be made that he should have won that one, considering Brian Battle weighed in 4 pounds overweight. And he did look way bigger in that fight, and it was a very, very close fight, both in the striking and the wrestling. I actually thought he won, but very close. And I think he is a very well-rounded fighter. His striking is probably his edge, but, you know, that's being said, he's definitely dangerous on the ground as well, as we saw with his fight with Zaleski dos Santos. He both dominated him on the feet, and then even when Santos was able to take him down, he just reversed position and start threatening submissions. And I think that Randy Brown is a really good fighter, with his only real loss in recent years being the Jack Della Maddalena. But I mean, come on, that guy's going to be champion soon potentially, so not a bad loss at all. Nicolas Dalby recently got very controversial split decision over Renat Freketnov, where he, the striker was pretty even, but Freketnov took him down in every round and looked substantially better on the ground. Before that, he got a pretty impressive comeback KO over Gabriel Bonfim, where prior to round 2, he was getting beat up and the damage was really starting to show on his face, but then he managed to finish Bonfim with a KO in the second. He did have a good performance over Muslim Salikov as well, where he sort of held his own throughout the whole fight, but I think Salikov is a very average fighter, so I don't rate that win too much. And throughout his career, he has had a lot of decision wins, with a concerning amount of those being split decisions. And I think if this fight goes to decision, I cannot see Dalby being able to sort of outperform Brown, and I 100% see Brown taking it by decision if it does go to decision. So for that reason, I'm going to go with Randy Brown by a decision win. Next up is Michel Pereira versus Abbas Magomedov. So Michel Pereira recently got exposed by Anthony Hernandez in their recent fight for having absolutely no cardio past the first round. He sort of has his flashy first round, and then as we saw, he just would absolutely gas out and stop being a threat at all. In that fight, the striking differential, Hernandez threw 152 significant strikes while Pereira only threw 24, and Pereira got taken down 10 times that fight, so he really didn't look great. He got submitted in the 5th, TKO'd in the 5th. And I do think that he may have worked that issue out since, but it can't be denied that in the first round he is incredibly dangerous. Both in his fights with Olasejchik and Ihor Peteria, the first round was incredibly dangerous. And he'd come out the gate hot, throwing these crazy moves, and he ended up submitting both of them, I think. But I do think as the fight goes on, he does slow down, and I can't trust him to keep the same pace throughout the whole duration of the fight. Abbas Magomedov had a really surprising performance against Bruno Ferreira in a fight that I thought he'd be finished quickly, but he managed to wrestle and subdue a very dangerous knockout artist in Ferreira, and he even outstruck him in the first round. He did look very good as well against Wally Alves, where he mixed up his striking and his wrestling to sort of absolutely dominate. And he did lose recently to Bolaro, but he did stand with him. Didn't mix in any wrestling, which was a fatal mistake against someone like Boralo. And I think his biggest tool is his wrestling, that he sort of handicapped himself in that fight. Do I think Michel Pereira is as good as Bolaro? No. I don't even think it's close, so I can see Abbas being able to gas out Pereira with his grappling and maybe even beating him up on the feet at certain points, but overall I'm going to have to give this one to Abbas Magomedov by a decision win. Moving on to the next fight, we have Giga Chikadze versus David Onama. So Chikadze constantly goes to these very close decisions in his fights where his striking is decent, but he just doesn't do enough and he makes it very, very close. Such as with Arnold Allen, that fight was very, very close. He didn't have any moments where he looked particularly impressive or anything fight defining, and he ended up just getting outstruck and losing to Allen in a pretty close decision, but you could argue Allen won that one. We saw this again with Alex Caceres, but this time he just barely did enough to scrape a win, but overall didn't really show anything that definitively won him the fight. He also has a hole in his grappling, losing a 5-round fight against Calvin Kattar, where predominantly throughout the fight, Kattar was using his grappling to sort of push him towards that decision win, and Chikadze wasn't really putting up much resistance, which ultimately went to the cards and caused him to lose. David Onama, he recently had a pretty fun fight with Robert Romero, where he made it very competitive on the feet, which I think was where he shone, especially in that fight, and on the ground, he'd just land this ground and pound and sort of secure a win through that. Also, I do think he had some pretty decent power in his hands, where in his fight with Gabriel Santos, he sort of lost that first round being out-grappled, and then got a nasty KO in the second to win him that fight. And overall, I just see it going to a very, very close decision, with the win ultimately going to whoever looked busier. And I can see the trend repeating itself of Chikadze just not being able to do enough to make a statement in a fight, and just losing to a lack of really doing anything. And I think Onama might have his moments which will make him stand out in the judges' scorecard. So for that reason, I'm going to go with David Onama by a decision win. And now moving on to the co-main event, we have Anthony Smith versus Zhang Mingyang. Jesus, man. Anthony Smith, he got bullied in his most recent fight against Dominic Reyes, which I think was both a combination of sort of Reyes on his comeback. We saw recently that Reyes still kind of has it. And I think it was also just Smith's downfall in performance and him sort of losing his love for the sport. Granted, there was that sort of issue during training camp where one of Smith's close friends died and he really didn't show much aggression that fight and was, I think, asking to sort of get hit. So he wasn't in the best mental space there, understandable. But even in that Delise fight where Delise moved up from middleweight to light heavyweight for that, which is a pretty big jump compared to all the other divisions, he just got out-volumed in that fight by almost double the factor. And then even in the second round, just got held down by Delise. And yeah, he did have a crazy upset win at 301, which I was amazed by. He was paying like $4 something against Vitor Petrino, and when Vitor Petrino shot him for a takedown, he locked in this guillotine that he just managed to hold on to and made Petrino tap. But do I expect something like that to happen again? Nah, not really. I don't really see Zhang putting himself in that position, so things don't look good for Anthony Smith. Zhang Mingyang, he is incredibly dangerous on the feet. He's only had 2 fights in the UFC, both have ended via vicious beatdowns followed by him being able to put his opponents out. And both of those fights he won performance bonuses, so he's really, really flashy when it comes to his striking. In that Romero fight, he did get caught a few times and sort of hit with these straight jabs before being able to put Romero out, but they weren't really doing anything crazy like dazing or stunning him. And also, granted, we don't really know how good his wrestling is. He hasn't really shown any takedown defense or ground game, which I think Anthony Smith will try and exploit in this fight. But do I think Anthony Smith is skilled enough to do that? I don't think so. I think Zhang will definitely outstrike him, and I don't think he'll get a chance to use much wrestling. And for that reason, I'm going to say that Zhang Mingyang's going to get this one done by around 1 KO. And now the main event, Machado Garry takes on Carlos Prates. Machado Garry is stepping up late notice for this fight, which would usually worry me with any other fighter, but we saw with his Shavkat Rakhmonov fight that, you know, even while stepping up on late notice, he did look very impressive, and he didn't really look like he lost much of his sort of skill. Granted, Shavkat was also injured in that fight, so it wasn't the most impressive performance from both of them. But yeah, outside of that, Garry is a very crafty striker. He sort of sets up these really nice combos using his height and his reach to catch opponents with the ends of his stiff jabs and straights, while also using his legs to sort of chop at their calf and body. But he's not just a good striker. In the MVP fight, he actually showed that, you know, training with Charles Oliveira, he's improved his BJJ a lot, and he almost submitted MVP within the first round, and he got very close to locking in these chokes once he got him on the ground. He hasn't really fought a heavy hitter before, that's the only problem, and we don't really know how good his chin is. I guess Jeff Neal, but in that fight, I don't really think that Neal really got a chance to show that off. There was a lot of cage clinching, and, you know, Garry didn't really throw much, neither did Neal. And that one was a very close split decision, and I think Prates does have more power than Neal, so I'm a bit worried about Garry this fight. Speaking of Carlos Prates, currently within the UFC, Prates has 4 fights. All 4 of these he won performance bonuses for, because he absolutely slept all 4 of these opponents badly. Most recently, we saw his power demonstrated with Magny, who is a really tough guy to knock out flush. You know, you can TKO him and this and that, but to put him out is a pretty difficult task, let alone the way that Prates did it. It was a shot so clean, it sort of pinged off the temple of Magny and sort of hit the off switch on him. It looked like he missed as well, that's the crazy part about it. However, Prates is far from unbeatable, and a lot of people are forgetting that with his fight from Trevin Giles, he looked pretty bad in those first couple of rounds before he eventually found that finish in the second, but he was getting tagged, and I think that Prates from back then is a different Prates to what we're seeing today. I think the Fighting Nerds camp has sort of made him rise to the occasion. And I think the power in his hands is ultimately just what will win him this fight if he does win, and it cannot be denied. He's the only person within UFC history to knock out Li Jingliang with not only a KO/TKO, but the way he did it was brutal. He sort of knocked him down twice, and then in that second round he got him up against the cage and just turned his lights off. And honestly, to break it down, ultimately I see this fight going one or two ways. Either I see Carlos Prates being able to put Garry away with his power and striking within the sort of first 3 rounds, or I see Prates slowing down and sort of losing his power while Garry starts to like implement the wrestling and BJJ and even his striking in the latter rounds of the fight. And I think in the last 2 rounds, Garry might be able to find a submission or take it to a decision. Another thing that everyone jokes about, but I'm actually genuinely concerned about, is how much Carlos Prates smokes. We've never seen him fight 5 rounds. In fact, we've never really seen him in the 3rd round, and we don't know how good his cardio is. So keep in mind, we could see him gas out by round 3 and sort of the fucking popcorn lungs start taking effect. But overall, do I think that Prates will win? Yeah, and I think he's going to do it via a knockout. So my prediction will be Carlos Prates via a round 2 knockout win. So that was it, guys. Those are my predictions for UFC Fight Night Machado Garry versus Prates. I hate the fact that I included Machado there. As you know, my predictions, Cam's predictions up on the screen right now. I think they're decently different this one, but yeah, this is actually a sneakily good card. It's not the most amazing card on earth, but it does have some pretty good fights on it, especially that main card, and very excited for this one. Yeah, I'll see you guys in the recap video. Bye bye!